What's up guys? Today we're going to be taking a look at the Yamaha RX-V6. Before we get this unboxed, if you are new to the channel and love home theater, be sure to tap the subscribe button for new weekly videos. Alright, let's see what's in the box. Inside we get some documentation and the antenna. Here's the YPOW calibration mic, the remote control, and lastly we have the batteries. Now this is a 7.2 receiver rated at 100 watts at 2 channels driven. It's got a brand new look that's very different from the previous year's models. Up front the volume dial is now dead center, and next to that are some touch sensitive buttons. On the far right is the selection dial. On the bottom left is the power button, USB, microphone, and headphone inputs. The whole front fascia is a glossy plastic, and the dials, I'd say, have a light plasticky feel as well. Size-wise, it's 17 inches wide, by 6 3/4 inches high, by 14.78 inches deep, and it weighs 21.6 pounds. There's plenty of ventilation on the sides, with this interesting pattern, which extends up to the top. Around the back are 7 HDMI ins with support for 4K 60 444. It'll also support 8K 60B, VRR, ALLM, QMS, QFT, and HDR10 Plus with a future firmware update, so no support for that out of the box at the time of this video. It also supports EARC. There's pre-outs for Zone 2, the front left and right channels, and 2 subwoofer outputs. The subwoofers will play back the same exact signal, so they're wired in parallel. There's 1 optical and digital coax, 3 analog ins, and a phono input. The speaker binding posts are on the bottom. The surround back channels can be assigned to either Zone 2 or for bi-amping, and the extra speaker outputs are for either Zone 2 or for the height channels for overhead effects, or as Yamaha calls it, the front present speakers. Keep in mind though, since this only processes 7 channels, the surround back and presence channels can't run at the same time. The receiver will automatically switch depending on the input signal or the DSP being used. We're going to have to see how that works once we get it hooked up. For setup, I'll be using the Yamaha in my dedicated theater. I'll be using a Zapiti media player and an Apple TV for demos. The Yamaha will also be powering 7 B&W CT 7.4 speakers, 5 lower channels and 2 overhead channels. I've also got 2 Martin Logan Balance Force 212s on hand for subwoofers. Once you tap the setup button on the remote control, you will get the user interface on your display. If you don't want to go through the on-screen menu, you can also access the same settings through the web interface. All you've got to do is type in the receiver's IP address /setup and you'll be good to go. Under the Generals tab, we've got power control for the main and Zone 2. You got a sleep timer from 30 to 120 minutes, volume control for both zones, mute at either off. You can attenuate it at 40, 20, or you can always keep it on. This is for when you hit the mute button on the remote control. You can select your input from here. Select your scenes from here. You can turn the decoder on straight, or if you want to pick a different DSP function, you can choose that here as well. You can turn pure direct on and off. Use YPOW volume after you've run YPOW. Turn YPOW adaptive DRC on and off. You got you've got DTS dialogue control, dialogue lift, your subwoofer trim, tone control here. You can adjust here at the bottom. You can do extra bass on and off if you want to do large speakers up front and then the subwoofers at the same time. You can turn the enhancer on and off here as well. Under the speaker tab is where you're going to set up your power amp assignments. First option here is basic. Since this is a 7-channel receiver, your main room is only going to be able to power 7 speakers. So here you can see it says main max 7 channels. It's not going to be able to bi-amp, but you will have speakers hooked up to the front presence output, which is extra speaker 1, and for extra speaker 2, that will be assigned to surround back. since it is only 7 channels, you're always going to have your main 5 channels working, which are your front 3 channels and your 2 surround channels. If you're watching something in Dolby Atmos or DTS-X, then the extra speaker 1 front presence will be active, so you'll get your lower 5 channels and then your 2 overhead channels. If you're watching a non-Dolby Atmos or DTS-X mix, then the extra speaker 2 surround back channels will be active if you're listening to a 7-channel source. So at no time will you be able to have the overhead speakers playing and the back speakers playing at the same time. Depending on what source you're listening to, either a 7.1 mix or an Atmos or DTS-X mix, the receiver will automatically turn on and off those specific speaker outputs. So it kind of changes dynamically for you depending on the content that you're listening to. The second option we have here is 7.1 plus a second zone. Again, if you're listening to a 7-channel mix in your main home theater room, you can always have 7 channels, your lower 7 channels playing all the time, but your overhead channels will not be active because the second output, which is extra speaker 2, is going to be assigned to either surround back or to the second zone. So if you were to watch something in 7.1 channels and then you clicked on zone 2, the surround back speakers will shut off and it will automatically power zone 2, which you can listen to a different source in that zone. So now you're left with 5 speakers in the main room, which is your main home theater room, and then you've got something else playing in the second zone. So at no time will you be getting any kind of Atmos or DTS-X overhead effects using this option. The next option we have is 5.1.2 plus a second zone. So very much like the other setting, this one you will have all your 7 channels active in the main zone. So you will have your extra speaker 1, which will either be front presence, or extra speaker 2 will be powering your zone 2. So if you're listening to Dolby Atmos or DTS-X, you will get 5 channels being active on your lower channels, and then your 2 overhead channels playing. And then your extra speaker 2 output will always be used to power the second zone, but you will not have your back speakers active. If you don't plan on using zone 2, then I would just say, just go ahead and use the basic setting. So this way you'll have all 7 channels on the bottom playing, and then if you are listening to something with an immersive format, Dolby Atmos, DTS-X, then that'll just automatically shut off the back speakers, and then you'll have overhead speakers playing. So for my case, I'm going to be using the basic setting, since I will not be powering a second zone. And then lastly, you've got 5.1 biamp, which would just let you biamp your front speakers. Under config is where you're going to configure all of your speakers, whether your front speakers are large or small, crossover from 40 to 200 hertz, center, either none, small or large, virtual cinema front, your surround back, front presence, you can do the crossover for that, your layout as either front height, overhead, or Dolby enabled, which are the reflective speakers, subwoofer on or off, and you can also adjust the subwoofer's phase from here as well. For speaker distance, you can either choose meter or feet. You can change this in increments of 0.2 for levels, increments of 0.5. Equalizer, you can keep it off. GEQ, YPOW flat, natural or front. These will be available after you run YPOW. If you want to go change everything manually, you can do that here as well for every single one of the speakers. And then lastly, under speaker impedance, you have a selection for either 8 ohms or 6 ohms, but you always want to keep that on 8 ohms. Under sound, you've got dynamic range, maximum standard, minimum auto, adaptive DSP level on off, virtual surround back on off. Got your lip sync settings here. You can enable this for all of the inputs. You can assign what audio input goes to what input here. So HDMI 1, you can assign audio 1 over to HDMI 1, or audio 3 over to HDMI 1, and vice versa. Input trim for every single input. volume at either -60 or +16.5. Initial volume, you can keep this on or off. If you keep it on, you can specify at what volume the receiver will turn on at. And then you can keep everything here in memory. For DTS mode, if you're having an issue getting a DTS signal to play back, you can try either mode 1 or mode 2 here at the very bottom. Scrolling back up to the top, we have the DSP tab. If you are not a big fan of the hall in Munich, you can turn that and skip it, so that way you don't see it in your list of DSPs. Program select, you can either by default have it on straight, have enhancer on off, kick in all stereo mode, or kick it into chamber if you wanted to, by default. And under DSP parameter, you can change all the parameters of each DSP preset by changing the DSP level, room size, initial delay, liveliness, or you can reset it back to normal. You can do that for every single one of them. Going over to scene, there's actually a couple of buttons on the remote control for scene 1, 2, 3, 4. Once you hit it, you can either enable a specific input, recall a certain DSP program, dim the receiver's front panel, change the wipeout settings. So you can do all of this under scene, which are just little presets. Same thing here for zone scene as well. Video HDMI, you can turn HDMI control on and off. Standby through on off, 4K upscaling, ARC on and off, HDMI out audio. For HDCP version, you've got either auto or 1.4. As of right now, there is no HDMI 2.1 support, but supposedly it's supposed to be coming sometime next year. And for HDMI video format, if you're having problems syncing your video, very much like the DTS option, if it's not working for some reason, you can either try mode 1 or mode 2. I haven't had any issues, so I've always just kept it on mode 1. And for video out, you can specify what input goes to what selection here under video out. Here is your network settings. For Bluetooth, you can turn that on and off. You've got audio send, so if you've got a pair of Bluetooth speakers, you can transmit sound out to the Bluetooth speakers. So whatever you're watching on your television or a movie, you can also play back through a pair of speakers, or if you have a pair of headphones. Remember, your Bluetooth speakers must have its own volume control. Your headphones must have its own volume control, because the volume on the receiver will still control the volume of your main speakers. So in order to change the volume on your Bluetooth speakers or headphones, each of them has to have their own volume control. Still a pretty cool feature for late night viewing, or if you have somebody that can't hear the TV very well. So that's a pretty cool feature. And then of course there's audio receive if you want to send music into the receiver from a cell phone or a tablet or something. Here we have the tuner settings if you are an FM listener or AM listener. For system, we have some general settings here. You can rename your zones, zone 1 or 2. You can turn party mode on and off. Got your language settings, eco mode, memory guard, get a new firmware notice. Got your touch panel sounds up front, your remote ID. You can lock the volume knob. You can skip inputs. You can rename inputs. You can autoplay your internet radio stations. You can dim your display on the front panel. Show messages. Show the volume in either dB or in numerical value. You can play messages on the top or bottom of your screen. Get a bunch of trigger sections here. You can skip certain messages on the front panel. Under information, this is all the information you have about the actual receiver itself, model number, firmware version, system ID, and your network address. Then here we can reboot the system, backup, restore, check for a new firmware update, which we'll just do right now. And it says we have the latest, so nothing new there. And that is pretty much it for all of these settings. First thing we're going to do is run the wipeout calibration. Just plug in the mic and this screen will pop up. You can either measure a single position or multiple positions, which means 8. I've shortened this for the sake of time. Now, to test out how powerful the Yamaha is, I ran all the channels full range and shut off the subwoofers. I threw in Midway, which is one of the most bass-heavy soundtracks I've heard this year. You can check out that review on my channel, Spare Change. This film's got some heavy peaks at 35Hz and below, and will definitely test out the amplifiers in the AVR. Now, I hate to compare it, but as a reference point, my normal amps put out 200 watts per channel, and they have zero issues with maxing out all the channels' dynamics. The Yamaha for a $600 receiver did a nice job at driving my speakers full range. At my normal listening levels, it made my speakers adequately full sounding with decent extension. Pushing the Yamaha a bit louder than what I'd find comfortable, I found things got a bit more compressed up top and sounded somewhat edgy for my tastes. I normally wouldn't listen at these volumes, but there are certain movies that make you want to push things further. Introducing the subwoofers back into the mix and running the speakers as small alleviated the edginess I was hearing and opened up the mix once again. Moving on to a more atmospheric mix, I popped in Collateral on 4K Blu-ray. I wanted to hear how good the sound staging and spaciousness sounded.
Oh, whoa, whoa. Hey, yeah. Come on, man. I'm sorry. I didn't hear you, man. Come on.
What I heard was some good separation of sound effects placed within the surround channels. It's not the deepest sounding depth-wise, as I felt it pulled in more, but I was able to get a sense of the busy Los Angeles airport. On my reference system, I'm able to hear more air in the background. Cars and other subtle noises would seem to stretch things further out. On the Yamaha, I could hear some of those subtleties. It's just not as effortless. I suppose if I didn't have something else on hand to compare to, I'd be totally content. Since we know the Yamaha does fine with 5-channel and Atmos mixes, I threw in Bad Boys for Life, which has a DTS-X soundtrack. Going full on in a 5.2.2 configuration, this receiver does handle those big action movies just fine. Sound effects were placed in their respective channels, and panning was convincing. As I said earlier, using this with subwoofers is a must and does make this a fun little home theater receiver. Next, I wanted to use this with some more demanding speakers, so I hooked up a 5-channel Focal Sopra No. 1 system. I know, you probably wouldn't hook up a $600 receiver to 24 grand worth of speakers, but hey, I wasn't hating the sound. I did try the 2 wipeout settings to see what the difference was. Using the natural setting, I found soundstage was a little wider and had less of a focus on the center channel, whereas flat gave the center a much more pronounced presence and better balance with the left and right channels. If you want, you can use the flat setting. This will try and timbre match all your speakers to the front mains, which are left relatively untouched, but this is something that you'll have to play around with to see what you like the best. Now, there is one issue that I had with the Yamaha. For whatever reason, while using the Apple TV, if I was getting ready to watch a movie, the main page would play perfectly fine in 2 channels. Once I hit play, the receiver would not play the Atmos soundtrack for several seconds. Other times, it just wouldn't play it at all, or would kick in several minutes later. This doesn't happen all the time, but it's enough to be annoying and kind of a deal breaker, or so I thought. To remedy the issue, I had to go into the HDMI format section and change from Mode 1 to Mode 2. This pretty much fixed the issue for me, so if you're noticing the receiver not outputting sound fast enough, go and change that setting and see what happens. At the time of this video, the RX-V6A is priced at $600. I'd consider this an entry-level AVR with some good home theater chops. There's other things it does, like have support for Yamaha's MusicCast wireless home audio, and there's AirPlay support as well, which I used quite often. There's also support for Amazon and Google Assistants. I enjoyed my time with the RX-V6A. It isn't the most powerful receiver out there, but it's powerful in its feature set and also sounded good with some demanding speakers. It's a fun-sounding AVR and should give you an engaging surround sound experience. With a lot of folks staying at home nowadays and big top-tier Hollywood movies getting released on streaming services, I could see this receiver being a solid entry point into getting your feet wet into home theater and enjoying those movies at home. Now, we will have a more in-depth written review at audioholics.com for the receiver, so be on the lookout for that. As always, guys, thanks for watching. If you want, you can follow us on social media, and if you want to get bonus content, you can also find us on Patreon. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and remember, keep listening.